Sunsetting has the community torn in regards to PvE or PvP impact. We're going to discuss three major points in this video: armor sunsetting, weapon sunsetting, and loot as a whole in Destiny. The goal of this video is not just to speak on why sunsetting is important, but also why some community responses are vastly exaggerated in regards to sunsetting, and that the pressure here is on Bungie, not on you losing your time investment. It's a necessary evil in a game like Destiny to have sunsetting. As you continue to insert loot, and more loot, eventually new gear becomes devalued as the incentive to play lessens. You can't have everything from 3+ years be relevant all the time. It adds no reason to really care for a thing like vendor refreshes because average gear fits the same reasoning. Why should Bungie spend time and resources on vendors when loot becomes, I like the aesthetic? Let's be real, there's no difference from a last perdition with outlaw kill clip and quote, insert dope new pulse rifle name, also with outlaw and kill clip. Bungie isn't going to put a recluse replacement with Shaxx where people have 2,000 tokens stockpiled. Sunsetting, you'd all of a sudden care a lot more about every vendor that exists in the game. Whether you are talking about major MMOs such as Final Fantasy XIV or WoW, or games like Escape from Tarkov and Diablo 3, sunsetting is a huge factor in making sure the existing sandbox doesn't get too out of hand. While its main example is used in MMOs, it 100% exists in other games to reset the power climb. I know a lot of people just recently played the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I can guarantee you materia upgrades and weapon upgrades players have grinded for and spent time on will be reset come part 2. This isn't to shaft the player's time investment or to be lazy, it's to allow the designers of the game to properly balance the sandbox and RPG while you still look for something new. This idea here is the same. It existed in the old God of War trilogy, it's probably going to exist when the next God of War comes out. Not sunsetting leads to questions like, why should I play a new activity for armor when I already have my optimal set? Why should I desire a new endgame armor when I can just infuse the one I already have? Why play a new activity for this 150 hand cannon when I already have the best god roll 150 hand cannon in the game? Which adds to the few major problem points. So problem number 1 is player builds. Bungie is making you regrind pieces of armor. Bungie has already inserted the pieces in place to make armor one of the easier things to stock up on in game. Endgame sources, Prime Engrams now, and the new Redacted Engram coming next season all have extremely high chances at high stat rolled gear. I mainly play Hunter and Warlock, and I have 2 to 3 distinct builds per character just from casually playing. Most players at my playtime will have no issue finding pieces to replace a build they are looking for, or simply don't play enough to where losing a piece of gear is that much of a detrimental change to your time investment. What will change this though is how Bungie plans to use armor in the future, as armor as a whole in Destiny is bland, and this kind of relates back to the point I made before with armor to where it's just a stat replacement. There's no real reason in Destiny 2 to ever need to use an insane build. The builds we have right now are mostly based on mods that get a little plus minus based on stat rolls. Should armor in Endgame have an actual drive and difference, it will feel a lot more impactful to go from one set to another and rewarding at the same time. Transmog for all old gear is also a huge change that benefits this, as this is done in World of Warcraft and is also done in Final Fantasy XIV as ways to get around this loot refresh. Allowing players to retain their favorite look as the game evolved and moved forward was just a way for players to kind of be content with it. If transmog did not exist, I'd be in agreement that armor resetting is pointless in D2, as armor values don't artificially scale with our power increases. I'll touch on loot as a whole later, which is what I think the largest issue in Destiny is holding it back from going down the MMO route, but not having gear sets or any meaningful reward in the endgame other than here's some materials you can use to upgrade is extremely bland and is the bigger focus in my opinion than losing one piece of armor 1 year from its release date. The next major problem is weapons. So not sunsetting weapons creates a set standard of weapons, no matter what you do balance wise. You can buff 140s, Austringer would then take the slot. Spare Rations still remains the best 150 statistically in the game. Even with Revoker nerf to its power, or to its perk, it's still one of the best snipers in the game due to snapshot and its zoom values. It would be a never-ending plus-minus curve of value changing to which every player's opinion results in, well, is it Spare Rations? Well, is it Mindbender? Well, is it Recluse? Which, this opinion exists sunsetting or not, but the question I raise you is this. Would you rather A, you grind for a weapon for it to be hammered for balance, which hurts time investment, Or B, you grind for a weapon which retains its power in Endgame for a year before eventually being rotated out and stays relevant in pubs all the time. It hurts time investment, but it still retains its usefulness. Now, not assuming outliers, I personally would take B every single time. Option B prevents people from being more frustrated about their time investment. Like, let's say, for example, Bungie decides to remove quick draw from aggressive shotguns like Mindbenders. That kills your time investment because quick draw makes a gun. Or even the changes to Not Forgotten and Luna's Howl. That change doesn't need to happen with sunsetting, as your old guns still retain their power elsewhere. A few other points I see to kind of counter this are A, mastery of weapons, B, it's lazy design to just not make better weapons, and then C, the new player / average player's time investment. So starting with the first point, weapon mastery. Trials and Iron Banner are not up 24/7. I think it's a massive exaggeration to think that going from using a Tatara's Gaze to using Beloved, if you're just going to use a recent example in Trials, takes that much of a difference in skill to where it will hurt you gameplay wise. If you are good with one weapon, you're most likely just as good with the latter, as weapons feel similar. Even if you want to throw light level into the mix, the only time early light level is relevant to something like a Tatara is when level differences are so massive player A can abuse kill clip on low level player B, which again benefits the person that has more time played than the person recently showing up to try and play and be relevant with the new activity. On top of that, as you close out a season of Trials or Iron Banner, players' levels are all the same as they start to plateau, and the level curve is no longer significant. So showing your mastery with the gun is no different than just using it in standardized play. The one thing I will say with this is just please don't be baited by videos of people deleting their whole vault. I don't understand really what's worse, being frustrated about your time investment possibly being hurt, and then just deleting everything you've invested all this time into before we've even seen the impact of the changes. I don't understand why people are doing this other for publicity, and it's a huge problem because the average player will watch this and think that's reality. This is extremely exaggerated and has no relevance at all to weapon retirement, and from someone that's played Destiny 1, please do not do this, as you will regret it, as it's something I did in D1 and I regretted, and then later you had to go through Prison of Elders in year 3 to attempt to get like a hopscotch pilgrim back. Don't do it. Keep your weapons you'll like. I promise you, you're going to use them. As many players in D1 did with their Matadors, they did with their longbows, they did with their judgments. Insert weapon in D1, players kept them. The other issue with this is players make grinds in Destiny with how loot is handled more complicated and more RNG strict than it realistically is or has to be. Some push for the 0.01% of roll chances that are not necessary because they do not change how the gun feels. This isn't to say you can't do this, but that it's important to remember what you're investing your time into and that you are making things more complicated, as the final 2 perks in the gun are usually what's most relevant in regards to weapon rolls. This is something that has recent relevance, as players have found stability and handling on hand cannons is 10 times more important than that of range. Even then, finding that 1 perk that adds +5 stability isn't going to change your gun's performance, as stats and masterwork as a whole on guns are not as impactful as they should be in Destiny 2. Your quick draw Mindbender with no range masterwork, so let's say 45 range, compared to mine with a range masterwork that has 54 range, is going to feel the same. It's the quick draw there that makes the difference. My 4 spare rations all feel about the same, even between range and stability differences. Why? Because of the final 2 perks rolled on the gun. The second major point that people have kind of used to counter is it's lazy design by Bungie to just not make better guns. The problem with this thought is Bungie has made better guns. Revoker and Recluse are 2 major examples of weapons made with better perks that the community has done a 180 on. Ironically, after the community stated both weapons would be bad because 1 is an SMG, and 2, why would I ever need free ammo returned on a sniper? The problem here is centered around the base idea of reload perk and kill perk, because these perks make you feel like your character is actually doing something in game. It's the same idea that Dado touched on in his 26-minute rant. You either create a perk that's kind of underwhelming that players don't use because they don't feel the impact, or you create a perk that's so good that players either want it to be an exotic or nerfed to the ground. This repeated issue is not Bungie being lazy, but trying to live up to the standards the community has set before them. Even if we get roles that are the same, it's at least a new incentive versus being content with your recluse because it still destroys nearly every kill-related perk in the game in terms of relevance. If we look at the Warmind weapons or the 7 Seraph weapons that just were released this season, this is the best example of this. We take 4 to 6 weapons that were mostly off-meta in PvE, tie them to a disgusting synergy with Warmind cells that put them into the spotlight. This is a build that most players take for granted or never realistically look at and test due to the dominance of weapons before them. And then the final kind of point related to weapons are the time investment in new players. What will new players do? This kind of ruins the average player's time. And here's my kind of counterpoint to that. The new player perspective is a really interesting thing for people to try and cite down as a negative for sunsetting. The majority of new players when content drops do not really care about old content. They want to push forward into new content as soon as possible and be ready for the new content. New in players that play a really average or short time, I would assume anything less than me, like you get on maybe once, twice a week, realistically would be in favor for this, and here's why. Because it takes the stressors and FOMO away from you missing weapons that dropped 8 months ago to be relevant in the game now. These players can stay updated with new content, find groups for new content, and feel like their gameplay now is relevant. If they get a new gun in the new DLC that's built for, they're going to feel good because that has a payoff directly to what they're playing now. It's not the player jumping in now, like let's say Timmy, our named average player. Timmy doesn't have to jump in the game now and then go, oh, well, you need that gun from 8 months ago to be relevant in what you're doing now. And then they question why, and then they try to grind it, get frustrated, and then stop. As old content should be a choice for most players at this point, not a high priority in the game, and a new or short time player entering the game. A lot of players who don't have time were focused on Bungie's push for FOMO, which is fear of missing out. This is a point that Bungie stated will not be a focus in Year 4 and Destiny going forward, as they learned it was bad for retention and replayability, because players get frustrated they miss something that ends up being important. Sure, some outliers exist, but with the vast majority of the player base on the push for the same gear and activities, it creates a better community-centered focus and actually improves player retention long-term versus being a negative. There's also other routes Bungie needs to go with this in addition, such as reworking the PvP playlists to have an efficient response, as having the 6v6 environment still contains skill-based matchmaking with a cluster of weapons would be a mess. I'm also not 100% sold on bringing old weapons back into the Year 4 season. This depends on execution. And then to round out the end of this video, the final problem is loot in general. Endgame loot from both PvE and PvP routes have sucked. Not one piece of endgame loot has mattered in Destiny 2 since Year 1. Should Destiny 2 want to continue down this action MMO route that Luke Smith stated in the Shadowkeep reveal, things like this need to change. If you were to look at things like Final Fantasy XIV, RuneScape, or WoW, there's a grind you grind out in the early to mid game that kind of funds your route into the end game. And then it's by grinding end game in specific areas that push your character further. Removing the exception of exotics, there's not one piece of gear in the dungeon, raid, Iron Banner, or trials that screams, oh my god, I need to have this. The big reason for this is due to mods. Mods come from the raid as kind of being their way of raid perks, but are accessible on any piece of gear from that season or the season before and after it, as long as it matches the element. This doesn't really separate the armor from any other set of gear other than, oh, it has a higher chance of 60+. All raid armor in D1 had the direct relation to the activity they were used in and made them important. And I think it's important going forward for Destiny to find a medium between mods and armor perks to make the endgame really stand out. Now, if you were to take a look at endgame weapons from endgame sources, there's 2 that stand out, and they were both in Year 1, and that's Midnight Coup and Sins of the Past. That's it. Honorable mention Emperor's Courtesy for its use in 1-2 punch hunter builds, but isn't really that good for low level content. The same goes for Iron Banner, where the best thing we've had is maybe Bite of the Fox and Wizened Rebuke. Trials is the only endgame mode that contains perks that benefit the endgame mode, being Celerity. But these pale in comparison to D1, where in raids you had Vision of Confluence, Found Verdict, Fatebringer, Black Hammer, Quillam's Terminus, Defiance of Yasmin, Ex Machina, the list goes on. And some of these guns even had perks that benefited the raid they were in. Trials in Iron Banner had Ephrodites, Fellwinter's, Iron Wreath, Nerwin's Mercy, Clever Dragon, Messenger, Doctrine, Winged Word. This list goes on too. I have God roll gear that I've grinded hundreds of hours for, and none of it, coming from a PvP point of view, feels remotely meaningful and as close to these weapons before. And maybe it's nostalgia, but you'd figure I would name a weapon in year 1 and year 2. The only thing that has really met this standard, ironically, is pinnacle gear. Fellwinter's Lie in Destiny 2 seems the first step towards that, with it being a unique archetype, and I hope that more combos are inbound with sunsetting being in mind. Loot just can't become desirable in this game unless there's a certain point at which gear would fall off. Otherwise, Bungie would continue running into the same problem they created with pinnacle gear. For Bungie to really make sunsetting worth it, they need to really bring it all this fall. If fall hits and it's the same archetypes and it's the same, it has Outlaw Rampage, and there's no depth changes to armor, and the endgame loot is still poor, the community will turn on it. And my own opinion in favor of it right now would drastically change. It's just important with all of this information to manage your own expectations versus lashing out at the sign of change driven by exaggerations. All eyes are on you, Bungie, and players, make sure you take a step back to realize what exactly you're getting into. And if you watch this video all the way, thank you when they're out.